keep in mind, while the Charlie Hebdo situation is, of course, an absolute disaster, and it's getting a tremendous amount of coverage, there was another terrorist attack, or I should say a terrorist onslaught in Nigeria. Boko Haram, get this, killed up to 2,000 people, according to Amnesty International. They just essentially gunned down everything in sight. And this has been a huge problem. They've been taking over military bases and expanding quite a bit within the last year. Vice did a great report on this a while back. I think we covered it on the show. And look, man, it's weird the way that Western media functions and what it chooses to focus on, right? Because by any objective measure, this is actually a way worse terrorist attack than the situation with Charlie Hebdo. Now, of course, it's all bad, and it all shouldn't have happened. But 2,000 people, I mean, that's insanity, and you're not getting much coverage in the Western media over this. And also, the U.S. government and other Western governments, they're really not paying too much attention to Boko Haram, even though Boko Haram is arguably right up there with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Shabaab and how dangerous they are as a jihadist organization and how much damage they're doing. So what's the answer? Well, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, whenever I see a situation like this, or any kind of situation where it's essentially a genocide of sorts going on, and by the way, there's a situation similar to this in the Congo where it's kind of reversed, where it's the Christians slaughtering the Muslims. So it's done for all different reasons, whether it's religious reasons, in other places it's nationalistic reasons. There's, of course, a giant problem with Muslim oppression in Myanmar. The Buddhists, of all people, are oppressing the Muslims, and they're very violent against them, and they burn shit down. And look, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how to respond to this, but the first thing that always pops to mind is, I guess the UN needs to get involved. But again, I find it fascinating that the U.S. government didn't really bat an eyelash over this. Like, they didn't say, I guess we got to invade Nigeria now, when, of course, they do say immediately we must invade if it's other places, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria. But for some reason with Nigeria, they're just like, yeah, some fucked up shit happened, but we don't really care. So, I mean, look, this has to, the conversation must be had that our foreign policy cannot be, clearly it is not just based off of being the world policeman, being humanitarian, because if that was the case, if we were doing that, perhaps the first place we would be in right now is Nigeria. We would be less focused on a place like Afghanistan, and we would be more focused on a place like Nigeria. We would be more focused in Somalia, for example, with the Al-Shabaab militants. We would be more focused in Mali, because in northern Mali, there's a fairly significant Al-Qaeda stronghold, or there was recently. I don't know if it's still the case today, but it likely is the case today, because it was only a year or two ago that it was an Al-Qaeda stronghold. So if we really went around based off of this principle of humanitarianism and being the world police, we would be in those places. And naturally, of course, where else would we be? We would be involved in North Korea. All these other places would be prioritized earlier on the list than the places we are in, which again naturally leads to the conversation of, it can't really be the reason that we're supposedly protecting everybody and standing up for democracy. I mean, the democracy angle of it is just comical when you look at the history of U.S. interventions post-World War II. But you have to understand that is a motivation. It is a motivation to focus more on, well, what are the spoils if we do go into said region? Sure, we may protect people who are oppressed in that region, but while we're there, we might as well take the mineral wealth like in Afghanistan, and the opium like in Afghanistan, and the oil like in Iraq, and other natural resources. It's often the case that the U.S. government chooses where they're going to do their interventions based on what is geopolitically convenient for the U.S. in terms of maintaining power around the world. They rarely do it purely based on humanitarian needs, because, again, if that were the case, we would have been in the Congo, we would have been in Mali, we would have been in Somalia, we would have been in North Korea. We would have been in a lot of governments that were dictatorships that we actively supported. See, that's the thing. Sometimes when we do get involved in places, it's to do the exact opposite of what we say we're going to do. What we do is we go in there and we overthrow a democratically elected government and we put in a puppet dictator to serve our corporate interests. Look no further than Iran, 1953, with the Shah. The democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, was going to nationalize the oil industry, and the West said, pump the brakes on that one, buddy. Not going to happen. You're gone, and here's the Shah, our dictator, put into place. Look at Chile, for example. There's all these different places, these different dictators that we supported, whether it's Allende, whether it's Suharto, whether it's, I'm trying to think of all their names right now as I'm on air, Marcos, there's all these different dictators we've supported over the years doing the exact opposite of what we claim we're going around the world to do. So there is no first concern for humanitarian efforts. But how is a country supposed to respond to this? Well, look, you guys know my opinion. It's the only time any country should use military force is to defend against an imminent threat against the nation. Now, the only exceptions to this, and these aren't even really exceptions, is a situation where it's a clear genocide happening somewhere overseas, and in those cases, you have to do it as an international community. You have to get approval through NATO, you have to get approval through the UN, you have to get approval through Congress if we're specifically talking about America here, and then when you do a mission in whatever place it is, you have to have along with you Australian fighter jets and fighter jets from Britain and fighter jets from France, and we do it all together because we can't have one nation above other nations. We need to have one nation among other nations, and we can't have this imbalance of power, because when there is an imbalance of power, what happens? It is always abused.